we have here Andrew Radegarvitz, Joshua Genske, Cecilia Muratori, Lidia Schumacher, Charles Tagliaferro, Richard Villaresau, and then also Stephen Clark and Lloyd Gerson. Thank you so much for being here with us. So, as you probably know, most of you probably know, this is the third session, third event in our series, The Shelves, which is organized by the group of Filosofia Antica at Torino with the fundamental support and collaboration of the Cambridge University Press. Thank you so much to Michael Sharp in general, and today also to Beatrice Rare for supporting us. I will very briefly share with you the overall plan of our series, just to here you are, to see where we are. We are the third meeting, and then next week we'll have the last meeting on authority and authoritative texts in the Platonist tradition. Just a reminder, CUP is offering a discount of 40% to anyone attending any of the sessions on any of the books presented in this series. So thanks especially to Michael Sharp for this. If you want to buy any books, please write directly to Michael Sharp, and you can find his email in the chat from now. So it is my pleasure then to introduce first the editors of this volume, namely Alexander Hampton and John Kenney. And I will first leave the floor to Alexander. Alexander Hampton is a temporary contract appointed assistant professor of religion at the University of Toronto. He specialized in metaphysics, poetics, and nature. And I will just mention a couple of publications. So Romanticism and the Reinvention of Modern Religion, the Reconciliation of Platonic Realism and German Idealism, the CUP 2019, and is editing the Cambridge Companion of Religion, Nature, and Environment in the West. So please, Alex, for the first presentation of the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Federico, and to everyone at Filosofia Antica at Torino for organizing this and the other events. They've been wonderful, and I've really been enjoying them. And of course, to our respondents, Christoph, Riedweg, and Enrico, Pasini, and of course to Cambridge University Press and Beatrice. If you'll just bear with me, I will share my screen. Hopefully you can see a slide there. So this book, just to give you a little bit of the background on it, in many ways it's the book I always wish that I had when I was a graduate student. The idea of the book first emerged when it was suggested to me by Mark McIntosh of Loyola University Chicago. Mark was in the process of editing an Oxford handbook on mystical theology, and he'd kindly asked me to do a chapter on poetics. And I said to him in our conversations, wouldn't it be wonderful if someday someone did a book on Christian Platonism? And he said, well, why don't you go do this? And this was in 2015. I had just myself completed my PhD at Cambridge. So I protested that this was not really something for an early career scholar looking for a job, but more something for someone much more further along in their career. But Mark was very encouraging. And so the next year when I completed that book on Platonism and idealism and romanticism with Cambridge, I talked to Beatrice about this book, and she's been very supportive throughout the whole journey. Indeed, I like to think that on the cover there, you can see Dante is accompanied by Beatrice in the 10th in the 10th canto of the Paradiso, visiting the theologians. And I like to think that's something of a tribute as well to Beatrice's guidance as we put together this, this very big endeavor. And then, of course, it was to find someone who could really help me along the way. And that's where John came in. And I got to know John Kenney at the annual meetings of the Platonism and Neoplatonism group at the American Academy of Religion. And he had always been a very welcoming scholar when I was there as a graduate student myself. And it seemed in many ways like a natural collaboration, because my own work focuses on Platonic metaphysics, but largely in a post-Reformation context, whereas John's expertise lies in classical antiquity, and particularly with Augustine. And so that allowed us to claim a coverage that stretched what we, the breadth of what we needed to do. And so really it was from there that the project grew, eventually bringing together 24 authors from 9 countries to produce this 500-page book on 2,000 years of intellectual history, which was not a modest undertaking. So to talk a little bit about the breadth and complexity of this topic is very difficult. However, we use an image in the introductory chapter that I think presents a kind of excellent starting point. And I'd like to read a brief passage, if I can, from our introduction, which is about this painting here. This is Der Camposanto in Pisa, painted in 1858 by the architect and artist Leo von Klenze. And it provides, I think, an opportunity to consider the multi-layered influence of the Christian Platonic tradition, both conceptually and through time. In Nuce, it offers what the many pages of the volume aim to explicate. The Camposanto Monumentale at the northern edge of the Piazza dei Miracoli in Pisa is itself built around the holy field for which it is named. The field itself is said to be composed of the sacred soil of Calvary, borne back to Pisa in the holds of Archbishop Ubaldo Lanfranchi's 63 galleys, which were returned from the Holy Land in the late 12th century. Lanfranchi's logic reflects, in many ways, I think, the metaphysics of methexis that was adopted so vigorously into the Christian tradition. What that position did was it held that all creation shared in divine being, and indeed that some parts of creation, in fact, concentrated that divine presence. In turn, beginning in 1278, the Holy Field was compassed with a cloister-like Camposanto building with its 4 covered colonnades, as depicted on the right of the canvas. The elegant tracery of the quatrefoils that enclose the cloister enact the kind of heavenward striving of creation back towards its divine source. The Camposanto, along with Abbé Sugar's rebuilding of the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis a century earlier, represents the development of the Gothic form that embodies this heavenward striving. In the middle foreground of von Klenze's canvas, drawing the eye slightly to the right, is a depiction of the fresco known as the Cosmographia Theologia, thought to be painted by Piero Pucci around 1390. And according to Vasari, it depicts God who with his arms holds the heavens and the elements, or rather the whole machine of the universe. And these are represented in terms of a hierarchical structure with the heavens, the angels, the zodiac, and then the elements of fire, air, and finally earth at the center. And then underneath these successive emanations of God, as if supporting the depiction from below and translating divine reason to human understanding, are 2 of the great contributors to our story, Saints Augustine and Aquinas. And then finally, with the two characters depicted to the right of the middle foreground, we're drawn to the perspective and the presence of von Klenze himself, who was living in the turn from the 18th to the 19th century and witnessed the Philhellenism of neoclassicism and the Romantic revival of Platonism. As the court architect and building director for Ludwig I of Bavaria, von Klenze endeavored to find a conciliatory passage in his own work between the rationalism of the French Enlightenment and the metaphysical realism of Hellenistic classicism. In his writing and in his design and in his buildings, such as the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, and here in his painting, von Klenze drew inspiration from the Christian Platonic tradition he observed on his frequent trips to Italy. Finally, the detail of the mother and the child act, I think, in so many ways to contrast and consummate the image. Their presence manifestly contrasts the kind of contemplative and structural atmosphere of the painting and the historical and intellectual layers of the Christian Platonic tradition that it depicts. Yet at the same time, they can be seen as consummating the central message of Christian Platonism, which after all is not an intellectualizing and abstract tendency, but rather a focus on the incarnational, the participatory, and the sacramental character of being, all of which call us back to its motive force in the overflowing of divine love. So hopefully that gives us something of an introduction to this broad topic. And now I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, John Kenney, who will give you some further details about the volume.
Yes. If I may, I will briefly introduce John, and then we start with the presentation, I suppose. So John Peter Kenney is Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at St. Michael's College. He was previously Professor of Religion and Humanities at Reed College. He's author of many fundamental works. I will just mention Contemplation and Classical Christianity, a study in Augustine, Oxford University Press, 2013, and on God, the Soul, Eva, and the Rise of Christianity, it is Bloomsbury, 2018. So please, John.
Well, thank you very much, Federico. Thanks also to Ariana and Julia for setting this whole program up. Now, I'd like to get my handout up there. Do you think you can handle that for me? See if we can pull it up. Yes, there it is. So what I want to talk about today is the actual organization, which may seem a little opaque to some of you when you first look at the volume. So I want to try to sort this out and explain it. I'm going to start by going through each of the sections and just looking at the actual titles so we understand how the project emerged. Now, our topic is the creative appropriation of elements of Platonism, right, into Christianity, and that's what we're really after. What we wanted to do is explore how Christian thinkers revised and then repurposed various Platonic elements. So the book begins with a discussion, Lloyd Gerson's discussion of the perennial value of Platonism. Then we go to the divine ideas as thoughts of God, and then the one in the Trinity, creation, begetting, desire, and recreation, the concept of theology itself and its development, and finally, participation, a very popular contemporary topic focused here on Aquinas and his Neoplatonic sources. So the initial part of the book is really designed to emphasize how Christians adopted various concepts from Platonism, but they were not engaged in just a pure reception. They were engaged in a very complicated process of reconsidering, revaluing, and repurposing these ideas. And so we wanted to begin with that conceptual transfer to underscore that point about the volume. Then we went into a more traditional sort of chronological rendering in section 2, history. But I want to underscore that these chapters were not really just surveys. They do some of that, but we really wanted interpretive essays. That's one of the things that we emphasize to the contributors. So all of these chapters then focus on how Platonism was an historical catalyst, if you will, for conceptual development within Christianity. We started off, we felt we needed something on the Bible. So we started off with Mark Edwards' treatment of early Christianity, its adoption of Platonism, and its use of the Bible in that complicated conjunction. I then did a chapter on late antiquity. We then moved into the Latin West, medieval West. We covered Byzantium. We had 2 chapters on the Renaissance, both the Florentine and Northern. And then into modernity itself, early modernity, Romanticism, and finally, modernity proper. So all of those chapters gave us a kind of chronological sweep. And the design was that they would accentuate the earlier conversation about the historical transfer of specific concepts. Now, the last section brings us to another feature that may not immediately be clear to some people about the book, and that is we were also very interested in trying to consider what we might call the continuing significance of Christian Platonism as a live tradition, because it is very much a live tradition within Christianity. So in this last section, we invited a whole variety of authors to speak to that question. And we have 6 chapters then, one on natural science, one on the environmental crisis in nature, Alex's chapter, on art and meaning, on value, dualism, and materialism, on Christian love and Platonic friendship. And finally, we're wrapping up with the one of the many, multiplicity in heaven and earth. So the theory of the book is that Christianity was engaged throughout its history up to the present day in a complicated conversation with Platonism. So for us, the term Christian Platonism really got at this relation. So we didn't go at this and say, okay, we're going to have a sort of essentialist reading, as it were, of Christianity and then sort of track that creature. We wanted to try to get at the creative interrelationship, the creative interweaving of Platonism, Christianity from late antiquity all the way down to the present, right? So we've constructed the entire book around, in a sense, that underlying theme. So that's my editorial perspective on what we were intending in the book, what the plan is, what the structure of the volume was, and I hope that clarifies what we were up to. Now, before I conclude, I very much want to thank Federico and Ariane and Julia once more for organizing this program. I've also looked at a couple of the earlier ones. I think it's a really neat and actually kind of cool concept of how to get at books when they've just come out. So I think it's pretty creative and interesting. Of course, I want to thank Beatrice and Cambridge for all your support, for the production of the book, and for that elegant Italian cover, which we all love so much. Personally, I think it has too many flying Dominicans, but it's a wonderful cover nonetheless. I'd like to see a Franciscan or Augustinian up there, but there we are. And finally, of course, I want to thank our speakers for today, Christoph and Enrico. But I'll stop now. We can turn things over to them.
Thank you very much, John, for this presentation. And yes, I can just add that reading throughout the book is a very intriguing thing. A lot of new knowledge and many questions rising, and I'm certain that our two speakers will provide us with further new insights in this. Then, before I leave the floor to our speakers, I would like to introduce Beatrice Rea from Cambridge University Press. Please, Beatrice.
Thank you. At first and foremost, thank you, Federico, Ariana, and Julia, for arranging this presentation on the volume on Christian Platonism. It is so encouraging to see that this volume is already attracting interest soon after its publication. So just a little bit of ancient history here. I learned about the Christian Platonism project a few years ago when Alex Hampton approached me about the possibility of publishing a volume on this topic with Cambridge University Press. And I knew instinctively that it was going to be an important contribution to scholarship in both religious studies and philosophies. So not surprisingly, I immediately said, yes, let's do it. But as we know, between that moment, hearing a great idea, and the publication of the book, there are so many steps and phases. It's a very long and arduous project process from a great idea to a physical and a digital book. I think the Italians have a great saying, fra il dire e il fare c'è il mare. And I really kept that in mind. And what was so extraordinary about this book is how quickly it came together. So many of these contributed volumes sometimes go on for years, decades even. And Alex and John just brought this together so quickly. So my huge thanks to them for being great managers, having a great idea, conceptualizing the project so brilliantly, but equally to the many excellent scholars who joined the volume, had belief in it from the start, and really, I think through their excitement, made sure that this volume really happened.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. And then let's start with our two talks. Just a quick note about the organization. We'll have Christoph Riedweg's presentation, then some question and answers. Then we'll have a break, a deserved break, also because these online events are very useful, but also 3 hours consecutive would be quite hard to follow. Then after the break, we'll have Enrico Pasini's talk and then other questions and answers. And of course, in the question and answers, we'll have some of the authors of the chapters of the book, but everybody is of course encouraged to join the overall discussion. So I'm now glad to introduce Christoph Riedweg. Christoph Riedweg is Professor für klassische Philologie, Gräzistik at the Universität Zürich. He was director of the Institute of Switzer in Rome, and he is now, since 2018, chairman of the steering committee of the Zentrum Altertumswissenschaften Zürich. I will just mention 3 of his volumes, of his books, Mystery and Terminologie by Platon, Philon und Clemens von Alexandrien, Pythagoras Leben, Lehre nach Wirkung, eine Einführung. And then I'm particularly glad to mention Kiel von Alexandrien, so the edition of Gegen Julian, and then saying this just because I had the possibility to use it in my critical edition of the Timaeus, and the editorial improvements I found there are incredible, and it is really a great achievement philologically and philosophically. So please, Christoph.
Many thanks, dear Federico, and all the organizers of this event. I'm very glad that you have invited me and therefore brought to my attention a volume which is really outstanding and dealing with one of the most fascinating topics, I have to say, something which has been in my mind already for many, many years, and I have learned a lot in reading and looking through this book. It is, of course, an extremely broad field, and I, for one, feel competent only halfway for antiquity, and I have to underline that. Even there, I'm more or less competent. So I will limit myself in the following minutes to chapters regarding this period, and even there, all I can offer is a few observations and thoughts that have emerged during a rather cursory reading. We are in Zurich here, still in the middle of the term, and I have to admit that I finished reading the important bits for me only this afternoon. Therefore, it's fresh from thought, so to say, but it's also improvised in a way. On the whole, I really think that this is a highly impressive achievement. And already looking at the table of contents, there are so many big names featuring there. Internationally outstanding experts like Lloyd Gerson, John Dillon, Olivier Boulnois, Mark Edwards, John Peter Kenney, Stephen Gersh, Douglas Headley, to mention only the few that have since long been, so to say, household names to me, and some of them even friends. Something which I also observed immediately, and of course in the following I will sort of saying positive things and then also insist on points where I have some little doubts or reservations. I found it a little bit sad that there are so few women actually inside. I mean, we have only Lydia Schumacher with an excellent contribution on Christian Platonism in the medieval West. You have Cecilia Muratori, who is, I think, present here also as a co-author with Mario Meliado for Northern Renaissance Platonism from Nicolas of Cusa to Jakob Böhme, and Catherine Pickstock on the highly interesting topic Christian love and Platonic friendship. I think a more equal gender balance would have been desirable, so to say. Every chapter I've read is in itself an excellent and very important contribution to its subject matter. And I'm really keen to underline this thickly right at the outset, because as I said already, in the following, I will also make some critical observations or hints at points where I think one could have gone even a little bit further. But I really have learned an awful lot in perusing this thought-provoking and also nicely produced volume. I found only a few typos, actually one a little bit awkward, but the rest not that much. And it's really a beautiful book to take into the hands and to read. And I should like to congratulate warm-heartedly the two editors, as well as all the contributors to this splendid achievement. The topic being enormously vast, it is almost inevitable that every individual scholar looking at it will have different ideas about what are to be considered the most salient characteristic of such a fascinating phenomenon as Christian Platonism. And I guess that depending on one's individual academic upbringing and research interests, everyone would focus on different points of views. Let me, in this sense, make a few observations on aspects that I, for one, would probably have weighed slightly different than the editors did. To start with the general organization and the table of contents, it was very interesting to listen to John Peter on how they conceived of it. And we have this chapter's concepts, we have history, and we have engagements. In reading the chapters, however, I have to say that the difference has not always been altogether clear to me. I have the impression that, for instance, chapter 2.1, The Bible and Early Christian Platonism by Mark Edwards, and 2.2, Platonism and Christianity in Late Antiquity, your excellent paper, John, could also well figure under concepts in a way. And conversely, 1.3, the chapter by Andrew Rade-Galwitz, the One and the Trinity, and 1.4, Creation, Begetting, Desire and Recreation, Kevin Corrigan, and maybe even 1.5, the Concept of Theology, and 6, Participation, since they deal with these topics in a really historical perspectives, could as well be put under his history. Therefore, this is something where I'm not so sure whether this differentiation is totally clear in a way. What I, for one, would have liked in a way to see included is a comprehensive chapter on the pervasive influence of the dialogue Timaeus for the elaboration of a Platonized Christian worldview, a topic, to be sure, which is dealt with throughout the volume, but still, I think it would have deserved really an individual chapter. It's so absolutely vital and important already for Platonism, of course, of late antiquity and even before. And maybe also a draft of the general socio-cultural situation of a globalized Roman Empire, which the emerging Christianity encountered, would not have been bad in a way to better understand how this phenomenon of Christian Platonism could really emerge. Such a draft should, I think, include a sketch of the contemporary system of education, a school system which of course was attended similarly by the pagan inhabitants of the Roman Empire and the Jewish Christian elite, which explains many of the commonalities between the two of them. Talking of Jewish Christian, I'm wondering whether the Jewish Hellenistic background of Christian Platonism has got the attention it really deserves. I'm thinking, of course, in particular of Philo of Alexandria, about whom goes the saying, e Platon Philonice, e Philon Platonice. It is true, this church father honoris causa, as David Runia has called him, is being mentioned on a couple of pages in the articles by John Dillon and Daniel Tolan, by Mark Edwards and by you, John Peter. But does this really do sufficient justice to his outstanding significance for early Christian theological thinking, which I think would be not conceivable without this preparation in Alexandria? And then, but this again shows the individual bias I have mentioned before in dealing with this vast area of research. I, for one, am of course quite surprised and also slightly sad about the virtually total absence of my dear friend Julian the Apostate. I'm missing him in such a book, such an important book. There's only one casual reference to his De Sole in Stephen Gurr's important chapter on Ficino. And this all the more so since Julian later became an important whetstone, among others, for Cyril of Alexandria, a whetstone which Cyril also worked on in elaborating his theological thinking. These two chapters would belong to the second section, history of the volume, whereas I still could imagine one additional chapter, and then I've finished with that, with this analysis of bits that would be important to me. And another chapter actually would, to my mind, also be quite useful, a chapter specifically dedicated to the main challenges which Platonism of the early imperial period and late antiquity posed for the basic tenets of the Christian kerygma. Even if with its Jewish background, the Christian message of salvation belongs together with the Greco-Roman tradition to the larger cultural koine of the Aegean world of the first millennium before Christ, it still represented a kind of foreign and even at this period of time archaic thinking, which intruded into the intellectual mainstream of the first centuries after Christ. We should actually, I think, not underrate this aspect because we are brought up in this Western European background tradition and therefore we think it and take it for granted that this is so familiar. But it was a strange element that entered in this particular moment of history into the intellectual general picture of early imperial period and late antiquity. I am thinking of topics clearly running against the commonly accepted and indeed absolutely essential Platonic typoi peritheologias, like the anastasis sarkos, the resurrection of flesh and body. It's running totally against the Platonic assumptions, I think. The incarnation of Christ as the Son of God. How can the highest divine go so low as to mingle with the most inferior material things? And not to speak, of course, of the passion and most ignominious death on the cross, which we'll celebrate the next days, of the most divine in the person of Jesus, a core issue of Christian teaching, which a Platonist like Porphyry could at most accept as a symbol of the soul's descent into the world and its return to the intelligible. Actually, I'm also a little bit surprised that Porphyry's sympathetic, if reductionist, treatment of Christ's divinity and his passion in Philosophy from Oracles is not mentioned at all in the whole volume. I think this is really very important. And of course, another intellectual challenge facing the early Christians on the background of contemporary philosophical demands are also the evident gaps in the content of the clearly older Mosaic creation account in comparison to the Platonic Timaeus, e.g. the absence of any explanation of the origin of the higher intelligible realm. Again, these are topics that are at odd pages dealt with, but I think they would have deserved to be brought up right at the beginning in order to make it clear what a real challenge and also sort of provocation it was also for the Christians to try to integrate, to amalgamate the two traditions. There were really, really big problems to be overcome on the long run, which looking back seem smaller than they probably were at the time. As I said, they are all really dealt with, but they remain stumbling blocks for integrating the Christian message into the contemporary intellectual framework of pagan thinking, and therefore would deserve probably a chapter of its own. Let me now add a few personal impressions, and I cannot offer more than that from reading the individual chapters, going along the chapters, and I will talk only on chapters where I feel more or less competent. The first chapter is an excellent ouverture to the whole volume by Lloyd Gerson on the perennial value of Platonism. I found it extremely useful and clearly written, this outline of the great picture of Platonism as a system, including, and I was particularly happy about that, also Plato's oral teaching. I was just slightly taken aback right at the beginning when it is underlined already among the most distinctive features of Plato's philosophical system, and actually it's the first one, his rejection of the naturalistic, scientific and philosophical approaches of his predecessors in favor of a radically different mode of explanation. In view of the many pre-Socratic elements in large parts of Timaeus' account of the origin of the world, I would probably phrase it slightly differently. Of course, then you later on in this chapter, you also say clearly that your point of reference is the sort of autobiographical presentation of Socrates in Plato's Phaedo, where he clearly sort of distances himself from the Anaxagorean natural philosophy, but still it remains actually, to my mind, as a summa of the pre-Socratic philosophical thinking, something which, of course, without this tradition before would be inconceivable. But besides this little reservation, the chapter here in my book, if I wanted to show it to you, is more or less on every page fully decorated with colored underlining, which indicates my agreement, even enthusiasm for many formulations, regarding, for instance, among other things, Plato's unhypothetical first principle of all beyond essence, of course, the overflowing epireuton of the good, the idea of moral responsibility of human beings, the rational soul, the demiurge or nous, but also the later developments of Platonism, starting with Plato's pupil Aristotle and going down to Proclus and Damascus, and including a short outlook on the Christian encounter with Platonism. This is really a crisp and highly effective introduction to the whole volume. The second chapter, again, by one of the best known specialists of the history of Platonism today still, the Ideas as Thoughts of God by John Dillon and then also Daniel J. Tolan, is actually based on a recent publication of John Dillon's, which was a series of lectures he gave in Beijing, The Roots of Platonism, with additional sections by Daniel Tolan, and shows the well-known sovereignty of the author, who is one of the best living experts of the Platonic tradition. I find highly interesting also the contribution by Andrew Radegalwitz. I think he's present too, or not? Did I understand that right? Or not? Anyway, I mean, this was really very interesting for me to read The One and the Trinity. In the first chapter, he documents the extent to which Christians were eager to harmonize their Trinitarian ideas with those of the Platonic tradition. And in the second chapter on Arianism as Platonism, ? He takes into account in a very illuminating way, I find, also the history of research on the topic and how it is disputed till today in Christian areas, of course, because it is a hot topic, whether the Christian original message had been transformed or even rewritten so as not to be recognizable anymore, or whether it is a natural kind of development and things are very closely together. He mentions in particular the Swiss theologian Hans Urs Cardinal von Balthasar and the extremely influential German scholar from Berlin, Arnold von Harnack, and also refers to modern supporters of the traditional doctrine who often assume that the Orthodox Trinitarian theology, denying that the Son and the Spirit were created and thus part of the cosmos, would have mostly overcome Platonist inspirations. He's talking about this Arianism as Platonism trope. And of course, I mean, he sort of relativized a little bit this trope, at the same time also saying that it's quite evident that Arius was heavily influenced also by, in particular, Neoplatonist thinking. But it is actually a never-ending controversy of how thoroughly Christian religion has been Platonized in these centuries. One additional point that has cropped up in my mind when reading these very subtle and illuminating pages is the question, which I have put myself already since long, but never really looked at it very closely, whether one should not also reckon with an influence from middle rather than Neoplatonism on the development of the Orthodox Trinity concept. I'm thinking, of course, of the doctrine of the three principles, which are based and deducted from a literal understanding of the Timaeus. They are considered to be equally eternal and therefore in some sense hierarchically on the same level, unlike the three Neoplatonic hypostases. Kevin Corrigan, in fact, briefly refers to the possibility that the demiurge and chora, as the Platonic term for later considered to be the hyle, may be coeval principles, labeling it something anathema to Christianity, which is of course true for the matter as such, but not for the incarnate, and therefore in some sense materialized Son of God. It is actually, to my mind, quite fascinating to observe that the catchphrase of the Arian controversy, en pote hote uk en, there was a time when he was not, indeed does also appear in pagan philosophical discussions around the 2nd and 3rd century. In Alexander of Aphrodisias, where he is commenting on the Aristotelian critique of Plato's unwritten doctrine, which has the ideas, even if being eternal, begotten from the hen and the ahoristos, which is impossible, he says, actually. And of course, there was a bitter controversy already in Middle Platonism, whether matter had been created or is equally ageneton as the other principles. I, for one, am tempted to assume that orthodoxy, in a sense, is actually rather based on Middle Platonic principles in a way. This is something which I have noticed also in other contexts, for instance, working on the Pseudo-Justin text, the so-called Coortatio ad Grecos, how the Middle Platonic thinking remains very present in the Christian realm well after Plotinus. Before then, the Cappadocians, of course, open up more also to the Neoplatonic tradition. Therefore, I have a doubt whether orthodoxy could not be labeled in a way more Neoplatonic as for the structure of thinking, so to say, not directly the same. Be that as it may, I would at any rate agree with Radegalwitz that the creature distinction becomes dominant in the Christian theological thinking, putting lightly, but not completely in the shadow, the Platonic intelligible, sensible distinction. Then coming to the next important chapter by Kevin Corrigan, Creation, Begetting, Desire, and Recreation, I should like to highlight his interesting attempt to show, in particular in Plotinus, that Platonic pagan thought was decisively influenced and indeed transformed by Christian Platonism. This is something which I, for one, have also noted, but rather noted in context of Iamblichus in a way. I think this is a very interesting point, because we, of course, think, first of all, always that the Platonic tradition has influenced the Christian one, but after a certain time in this concurrence between two Weltanschauungen, so to say, it is, of course, clear when you have an enemy, you take over also elements of the thinking of your enemy into your proper thinking, and this is evident in so many things. Maybe that here the tradition going back to the early academy to adopt a non-literal reading of Plato's Timaeus, as well as a thorough consideration of the Platonic agrapha dogmata, where begetting plays an essential role, could have led to other accentuations. This is actually, again, one point where I think one could have gone a little bit further, taking more thoroughly into account the agrapha dogmata, which really have this genan. It is begetting and producing and conceiving of. Therefore, it's not that far away of what we see then in the Christian Trinitarian and, or at least Christological tradition. And the desire to the one, that he also thinks, Corrigan, that this is particularly Christian. Yes, it is important in Christianity, but I would say it is something not totally alien to Plato. If we think of the Phaedrus, for instance, where he talks about the souls, glychomenai, men hapasai to anno. All of them have the strong desire to go up, and where he uses also this wonderful and profound melancholical picture of the soul who is on earth like a bird, looking always upwards and wanting to fly away and to be back where it was so beautiful. And then also Socrates says that he has been talking longer about this wonderful original experience, poto ton tote, in desire, in profound desire for what we have been living there. Therefore, I think there are elements also, for instance, at the end of the 10th book of the Republic, where we find similar kind of ideas. There we hear of the kinship of our soul with the divine and of the constant urge to reach it. It's a hormé that is sort of planted in our soul, and therefore this upward orientation anyway is very close. Whether this is so emotionalized as it is in Christianity or not is another question. By the way, something I've learned from my colleague from the Ancient Testament, that this loving God in the Ancient Testament in a way comes from the political sphere, where the Vasallen treaties sort of always asked the lower sort of population to love their king as much as they can. But anyway, this is another thing for the general background for the notion of love of God in the Ancient Testament. But it remains anyway a good case, which is brought forward by Corrigan, that Plotinus did not remain totally unaffected by his intensive study of Gnostic thinking. And Corrigan in this chapter also offers many fine observations on the Cappadocians, in particular Basil and Gregory of Nyssa. By the way, something which caught my eye in this article and also in not a few other articles, and which I would also like to bring up, even if it is also a slightly negative point, with one exception, which is Danielus' Platonisme et Theologie Mystique. The bibliography at the end contains exclusively English-speaking secondary literature. And to be sure, this has become quite a general tendency in contemporary scholarship, but it still makes me somewhat sad that over the last decades, the scientific community seems to lose more and more its cosmopolitan orientation and also appeal. There are indeed extremely important scholarly contributions, in particular in this realm, published in French, Italian, German, Spanish, and not taking into account, for instance, an excellent study like the one by Marco Zambon, Nessun Dio è mai sceso qua giù, la polemica anticristiana dei filosofi antichi, published only in 2019 and therefore a little bit late for the production of this volume, but still is sort of detrimental. May it be permitted that I recall this here to our friends from the English-speaking world, that an effort to take into account also literature not published in English would be worthwhile, so to say. Then coming to the next chapter by an excellent scholar of the medieval philosophy and thinking, Olivier Boulnat's chapter, The Concept of Theology. On the whole, this exceeds my own horizon of research. I have only noted at the beginning that he makes the remark that theologia in Plato designates only mythology. I would doubt that, but that's a detail, and the focus of this very learned paper is clearly on theology as a Christian rational interpretation of faith, and is quite illuminating how extremely important the Christian adaptation of the Proclean metaphysics by Dionysius Areopagita became for the further development of a Christian theology down to Eriugena and Abelard. Actually, Dionysius Areopagita is featuring largely in this volume, and for very good reasons, of course. This is impressive to see how important he was for the development of a fully developed Christian Platonism. 1.6 again is not really my area of competence, but in perusing it, it did strike me as being also very solid and interesting. In a way, I find particularly refreshing Mark Edwards' sometimes also cheekily formulated chapter on the Bible and early Christian Platonism, which contains many sharp observations in dealing with anthropomorphism in the Bible, in the Timaeus. Even in the Timaeus, he discovers this anthropomorphic element, although one could, of course, say that most likely in the system of the Platonic thinking, the demiurge is not the highest of the realities, and therefore for the highest realities in Platonism, this would have been excluded anyway. And also talking about the relation of immanence and transcendence and the, I quote, seeming contradiction of his own nature, which we call the incarnation. Can the Logos share the eternity of the Father? He talks also about temporal and non-temporal readings of the Timaeus, of allegory, although he plays it probably a little bit too much down, at least more than I would possibly do, and then formulates basic problems very astutely, as for instance on page 159 in the context of Platonic mysticism and homoiosis theo. How could Christianity, which repeatedly proclaims the gulf between creator and creature to be unbridgeable, permit itself to be influenced by a philosophy for which that gulf is merely an illusion caused by the soul's estrangement from its proper home? This makes things very clear in this kind of formulations. Also, the chapter by one of the editors, John Peter Kenney, on Platonism and Christianity in late antiquity is really a very rewarding read. He rightly highlights that philosophy in antiquity was much more than a set of rational discourse centered on theoretical analysis, that it wasn't, of course, this is Bierhado, whom he also quotes, that philosophy was also a real way of life, which was also differentiated, by the way, also according to the different schools of philosophy. Of course, a Pythagorean would live in another way than a Stoic and an Epicurean and others too. And that in this full sense, as John Peter writes, the Christians, one might argue, with the possible exception of the Platonist intellectual and pupil of Ammonius Origen, if he was the same or not, that the Christians were never really Platonists in antiquity when we understand more fully what being a Platonist actually meant. I continue quoting, their Platonism was informal and fragmentary and borrowed. And most importantly, they did not remain under the direction of a Platonist scholar once they became Christians, for they followed a different way and belonged to what came to be seen as a different and distinctive, and one might also add, and a competitive school, even if they were in some important ways fellow travelers with the Platonists. He's also right to underline the importance of the development of a type of monotheism within the pagan tradition, which, by the way, may find its root also in Plato himself, if one thinks again of the Agrapha Dogmata in this context. Quite surprisingly, John Peter Kenney's article is, together with Andrew Radegalwitz and Mark Edwards, the only one which briefly refers to the outstanding and not to be underrated importance of Exodus 3:14. Ego eimi hoon, I am the being, for the development of a Christian Platonism and the fusion between the two traditions. I think this is actually another core topic that could and maybe even should have been further developed in this volume, because it's absolutely essential and basic for the whole conception. He writes in connection with Justin Martyr's dialogue with Tryphor, God is in consequence unbegotten, unchangeable, and incorruptible. This fusion of the Platonic conception of being itself with the God of Exodus 3:14, who identified himself as the one who is, will henceforth become the linchpin of Christian metaphysics. And this is really very, very important. And you stress it again in connection with your dealing with Origenes. And also the extremely important question of the free will of humans, which already had been dealt with briefly in chapter 1.4 by Corrigan, and later crops up in Derek R. Michaud's and Davison Holsinger Sherman's papers, is being addressed by John Peter Kenney. Well, I think I should gradually come to an end. The following two chapters, which are still somewhat close to my own competences, but go also already far beyond, are the ones by Lydia Schumacher, whom I mentioned already, Christian Platonism in the Medieval West. Extremely interesting how she also talks about the Arab tradition and sort of the way the Arab world has then taken up this whole philosophy of late antiquity, and also the chapter by Thorstein Theodor Tollefsen on Christian Platonism in Byzantium. They both strike me, even if I'm not the expert in their areas, as being absolutely stimulating and very well written. And it was a pleasure actually to read a little bit in these chapters, as well as I did in the other chapters, without being able to give a very close look at these papers. It was, of course, impossible now to do justice to this impressive volume in such a short span of time. And as said at the beginning, everyone, depending on his or her own interests and competences, will find different strengths and sometimes also detect smaller lacks in this wonderful book. But it is a wonderful book, there's no doubt. It's a major achievement, which is so rich of fine and thought-provoking scholarship that it deserves a big and large reception. And I have to say that I personally have learned a lot from this book, and I'm sure I will still be learning a lot, time permitting. Therefore, many, many thanks again, and congratulations to both editors and to all who have contributed to this wonderful volume, also Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Christoph, for this presentation. This is, of course, the part of the volume devoted to antiquity, and indeed, I have some questions and curiosities about this. Then we have, of course, we will be led through the other centuries then. But I would now open a discussion on Christoph's presentation, and in general, of course, on themes related to Christian Platonism in antiquity, and so please, anyone wanted to join us for discussion could, of course, raise the hand function. But first of all, of course, if Alex and John want to say anything, please, I would, of course, encourage you to add anything to the talk, if you want, of course. Please, John.
I want to thank Christoph for that very, very interesting response. There are so many technical issues and issues that I wish I could discuss with you at a greater length. I have to say, first of all, having edited a book on Philo, I very, very much feel, as you do, that the story of Christian Platonism begins in Hellenistic Judaism. There's absolutely no question about that. And one of the problems in our analysis of early Christianity, again, freighted by so many different conceptions of early Christianity, part of them coming out of the Harnakian tradition, is that whole Hellenized Judaism has been pushed to the side in the general understanding of what goes on in early Christianity. So I couldn't agree more with you about that. I have to say, I wish we could have had, gone back and done the whole story. But again, there are limits. And I would point out, and I think your many points about, the lack of English, non-English scholarship and so on. One of the things we were doing here, as I said in my introduction, was the book has a kind of an argument. We wanted to look at the long sweep. To do that, we couldn't really do, as it were, encyclopedic style, full scholarship on each of these periods, right? So we had to sort of surrender that. And moreover, since we were writing these works in an English speaking environment directed towards the continuing appropriation in our world, that so we had to lighten up on the bibliography and limit things. But in any case, I would point out that just recently, within the last month, Mark Edwards has brought out the work that I'm sure you want to see, which is his huge volume, edited many contributors. I did the Augustine chapter on early Christian philosophy, which is very much more that kind of complete drill down just on that early period. So when we were writing this, producing this, we understood that we were trying to locate ourselves, as I said in my introduction, in a very specialized zone. And so we had to give up things. By the way, we couldn't agree with you more also on the gender balance problem. And I'm sure that Alex might want to remark on this as well. We're very chagrined that a whole group of women scholars that we had invited, unfortunately, were too busy or in one case dropped out. And that's just an unfortunate situation. Sometimes I think of volumes like this, as we say in English, they're like time capsules. They capture the field at a particular point. I'm sure when this is redone, as it might be 20 years or whatever down the road, the composition will be very different. So yes, we agree with you. We wish that things had been different. We tried very hard to find and to invite scholars of the appropriate stature, and also some young scholars who were women, and we ended up where we were. So that's a very valid criticism. I don't want to take up too much time. I wish I could go through many of the comments here, but I thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you very much for your work.
Alex, please, if you want, or of course, any of the authors of chapters, or anyone.
Well, I just to say again, thank you so much for those comments, which I'm in absolute agreement with, and I think it would be lovely to have chapters, as you said, particularly on Exodus 3:14, that central idea. As someone who works on, who's worked quite a bit on Romanticism, of course, we know how central that passage is, particularly for someone like Coleridge and the notion of the Platonic imagination. And again, chapter on the Timaeus and its continuing importance would have been, of course, I think a very valid one to have in the book. But I think, as John said, it's to do a book on 2,000 years of intellectual history. Obviously, a few things will be left out. But what I think is excellent in this conversation is that I think these areas need to be further explored. We need more scholarship on them. We need more discussion on them, and hopefully this book, in fact, spurs further scholarship, pointing out, well, why wasn't this area more elaborated on? And I hope if the book has a legacy, that should be part of it. And then the other one, of course, to have a greater diversity of scholars within it, which I think John's comment about it being a snapshot is, I think, an accurate one, because it is a struggle to find a range of people dealing with it. But the lovely thing is, in the process of doing it, and in the process of teaching these topics, I've seen a greater diversity of students coming to work on this material and explore it. So I'm excited to see what we'll have in this field in the next decade or so. But thank you very much, Christoph, for your comments.
And I see Andrew Radegaliewicz, who would join us, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Christoph, for your wonderful comments. I apologize that I missed part of it. I was confused on the time difference and had booked myself in another meeting, so I arrived late. My apologies, but I did catch what you were saying about my own chapter, and I wanted to follow up because I thought your idea that perhaps it's Middle Platonism rather than Neoplatonism that is more decisive. I thought that was really interesting, and I'm quite sympathetic with what you were saying. I in some ways chose the word Platonism, I think, in order to be vague on that the very issue, because I don't think that's terribly decisive for the Cappadocians or something. I mean, Augustine's fairly clear about which books he's reading. But not the Cappadocians. And it's interesting that also sometimes they're going back to the dialogues themselves. When Gregory of Nyssa accuses Eunomius of following, the Greeks, he's doing a direct reference to the Timaeus and the idea that the demiurge is ordering the younger gods, and that they would then be obedient to the demiurge. So it's not dependent on a Middle or Neo-Platonism. Even in that case, I do wonder if the three principles of Middle Platonism are the analogy for the Orthodox Trinity, or if it's rather that simply certain features of the nature of God, such as you see them laid out in Alcinous or different authors, are picked up quite directly by Basil and Gregory of Nyssa and so forth. So the reading of Exodus 3:14 as God as pure being and thus as simple and immaterial and so on, that they're getting that. And also I think they're getting the account of sort of apophasis and of ascent to divine beauty and so forth, perhaps from Alcinous and so some of those authors. So principles about divine attributes and divine language for God, but maybe not the three principles as such. In part, I say that just because they're so clear in like the hexameral literature and so forth in rejecting the Middle Platonist account of the material principle, that I wonder if they would ever draw on that positively. I mean the Cappadocians in particular, but others. But I thought that was really illuminating. And I, in some ways, my account, as you put it very well, was just to say that the idea that only the non-Nicene, only the non-Orthodox were following Platonism actually has it quite backwards. So thank you very much for that. Very illuminating.
Well, thank you very much for this really very interesting chapter. And I mean, you are the big expert on the Cappadocians. I know them much less than you do. And I would never say that in the Cappadocians, these three principles are still playing a role. I would rather say they were formative for ways of thinking in a way, because I mean, the discussion of matter was really hotly disputed. And there you have the same kind of discussions. In a way, I have not yet found the passage where it is clearly used, this en pote hote uken also of matter. But in a way, I always think of the Christianity, if you look at it, not from a Catholic or Protestant or whatsoever believer point of view, in a way, the divinity becoming so materialized, then it is quite close to matter in a way. And therefore, to adopt this kind of principle that you see this materialistic element in this second person is at least not so far away, in particular, if you think afterwards also that the spirit again has elements of the thought, of this formative element, therefore of the paradigma, and so as well. Therefore, I think as a structure of thinking, not one-to-one, but as a structure of thinking, orthodoxy is really in a way based on this three principle theory. And I've not yet found that. I've never myself really done a lot of research on that, but just here and there seen that. And because I think it's really absolutely clear that for the Arian tradition with subordination, it's the opposite. And we have Origen as the predecessor also for that, being a pupil of Ammonius or not. But still, I mean, here you sort of make it less important, this paradigm, but you also say that it has been influential on a rise. And I think it is absolutely clear. And therefore, if we start off sort of breaking it down to discussions only within the pagan Platonism, then you arrive at this opposition between Middle Platonism, and then you have this other phenomenon that for very long period, the specific Neoplatonic thinking does not yet enter into the Christian thinking. Not without reason, Eusebius is the main source for our Middle Platonic informations.
Thank you. Yes.
Richard?
Yes, if I may come in briefly, but I'm quoting from memory, and some of you may know this much better than I do. I think that Tertullian talks about Christ, the second person of the Trinity, as the matter of matter. So there is one connection possibly with the principal matter, but I better go look, see if I can find the actual reference for you.
Thanks. And other questions or remarks? In fact, there is one wider, thing which emerged from the old volume is, and which I think we are continuously discussing, is is how Platonism is to some extent inclusive if we consider it as a whole. I mean, in its general features, and how specific forms of Platonism contribute aspects, but of course are, from other points of view, incompatible with some Christian essences. So we have this double dynamic, which is very much interesting. For instance, one question I had, and in fact I found hints at this in a number of chapters, is, for instance, the relationship between some kinds of Neoplatonist theories with Christianity. And from a mythological point of view, this is more or less the point concerning the relationship between Middle Platonism and Christianity. Of course, you have points of contact and contradictory aspects. For instance, metaphysics such as those of Iamblichus and Damascus, which are mentioned in some of the chapters, of course, produce issues or puzzles to a Christian reader, I would say, especially in relation to the first principle. Especially if you have a reading of, I don't know, Iamblichus metaphysics as identifying the first principle with the zero, So with a principle which is extremely hard to conceptualize in any way, and has many intermediaries in between him and the creation, and so on. So this is one of the aspects which may be a stronger Middle Platonist metaphysic is more suitable respect to other metaphysics of Neoplatonist fashion, I'd say. But this is rather a question that I had. Other remarks or questions? Sebastian Moro, please.
Well, thank you very much for the presentations and the organizers, and it's very interesting, this topic. And my question is about not only Middle Platonism, but the influence of Neo-Pythagoreanism and even Platonizing Pythagoreanism, and how it's important for this relationship with Christianity, because not only Numenius, but also Philo was considered also a Pythagorean. And so Philo of Alexandria and was in a context of understanding these three principles also with the influence of Nicomachus of Gerasa, who also mentions levels of number and the numbers as thoughts of the demiurge. So what would be the influence or the importance of Pythagoreanism, and if it's also in Gnosticism, and because there are different interpretations of the relationship between the monad and the dyad, and the one above the duality of principles, like in Moderatus of Gades or Eudorus. So these different approaches to the relationship between the one and the dyad, and a principle transcendent to both of them. And that would be my question.
It's a very difficult question, and I'm sure there would also be other people who could answer this here. I mean, the question, first of all, is what is this Neo-Pythagorean tradition in a way? Because I would consider it rather some kind, sort of, to use an anachronistic term, like a confession. It's almost like being either Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, so to say. It remains Christian and it remains Platonic, and it has a special flavor then with some additional elements. We don't know how much of ritual it included as well. We have, of course, this kind of examination of conscience, which then also entered in the Stoic realm and became also part of the Christian tradition and so on. I mean, also this Pythagorean Carmen Aureum has many traits that would be easily being brought together also with a Christian lifestyle and things like that, also even monasticism and so on. It's very complicated. And as for the ontological pyramid, of course, you have the different layers. If you go back to Plato and to the Agrapha Dogmata, you have that available. And then if you reduce yourself, so to say, to the dialogues, you would not go that far away, because in the dialogues it's not expressed. And therefore we have only this ekeinates ousias, which without the help of the non-written doctrines probably remains somewhat elusive, or more elusive than with it, and therefore there are different options. And I would agree with what has been said also before, that maybe a more reductionist view, as was common among many Middle Platonists, although my impression was always that also Middle Platonists leaves open a whole variety of approaches as for the differentiation of the hierarchical pyramid, but still on the whole it is a little bit more down to earth than later on, when it becomes always more and more refined. But of course even Christianity has adopted that then also with different layers of archangels and angels and demons and so on. Therefore, really, I cannot give you an answer, but I would say, looking at the Numenius, who is probably the most Pythagorean, and then also the most outspoken positive about Christian tradition and the Jewish Christian tradition, it would be quite reasonable to assume that there have been contacts between the two of them. And what I think, it's really a problem also of transmission, because we have orthodoxy and Arianism and this kind of tradition, or later also the monophysitism and things like that. But of course, this whole tradition became form in an area of discussion where there were possible so many different heterodox kind of views. And Alexandria would have been full of different approaches. We get some glimpses as on that even already in Origin and in the environment of Origin. Then we have this Amelius, also very elusive. He's mentioned also in the volume. It's actually rather a paraphrase of St. John's Gospel, and you do not know whether this is positive. You do not know whether it's positive when Augustine says that the Christian should put the first 5 verses of the Gospel of St. John in every church in the apsid. This means probably that the rest of the Gospel of St. John is without any value. It's these 5 first verses which are in harmony with the pagan tradition that you should put there and forget the rest. You could also give this reading to this positive evaluation. Therefore, it's really complicated, and I think it's so sad that we do not know enough about these heterodox milieus.
Thank you, Christoph. And Gretchen Riedemskies has put in the chat the precise reference. Thank you for this, Gretchen. And so I would propose that we have now a short break, and that we start again at 6:35 with Enrico Pasini's talk. And then, of course, if there are other questions or remarks on the ancient part, we can get back in the last long question time after Enrico's talk. So see you in 10 minutes here. 6:35, please. Okay, so we can start for the second part of this event. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce a friend and colleague from the University of Turin. Enrico Pasini is a professor of history of philosophy at the Turin Department of Philosophy and Educational Sciences. He teaches history of philosophy and history of science, and he is currently the director of the Istituto per il Lessico Intellettuale Europeo e la Storia delle Idee, ILIESI, Rome. And he has worked on a connection between history of mathematics and history of philosophy, and on the interplay of life sciences, philosophy, and literature in the early modern period in general. And he has many current projects, but it is a pleasure for me to mention the one he has with other 2 Turin colleagues, that is Guido Bonino and Paolo Tripodi. They are 2 distant reading and data-driven research in the history of philosophy. Among his publications, I would mention just Corpo e funzioni cognitive in Leibniz, 1996, and Il reale e l'immaginario, la fondazione del calcolo infinitesimale nel pensiero di Leibniz, Turin, 1993. So thank you, Enrico, for being here, and please.
Well, thank you for the invitation. During the first part, my connection suddenly dropped, and should something now happen, so for instance, that you don't hear me, please say it in some way. I might maybe close the video to get better through in the sound. So as I think became clear in the first part, this work we are presenting today is a very complex volume. I must say that I am awfully ignorant of so many things and themes that are in the book, so that my discussion of today will be kept at a level that I can manage. That is, I'll deal with three rather simple questions, at least from my point of view, that is that of well, an expert, a scholar of early modern philosophy. So what is this book? What is this book properly about? And what is the or a moral of this book from my point of view? I'll start from the first one. So what is this book? At least what seems to me that this book is. It is clear that it is not simply, well, the subtitle notwithstanding, a history. So history is also the name of a section, as it has already been observed by Christoph Riedweg in the first part. There is history also outside this section. So it is clear that the book is more complex than that. And in fact, the book does more than simply tell a history or present a history. It seems to me that it also aims to provide for its subject matter, so for Christian Platonism, that is the title, identification. So in the book we find a lot of either, well, let's say both explicit and implicit discussion of it in terms of definition and sometimes of what in the history of science is called demarcation. So what differentiates it from similar phenomena. Together with identification, it seems to me that the book aims to provide an assessment of its subject, so an assessment of Christian Platonism, and also, at least apparently in the last part of the book, to provide advocacy for Christian Platonism. So to show how Christian Platonism is good for this, is good for that, to show that, if I may say so, Christian Platonism is good for you. I must say that I cannot really, I say it candidly, I cannot really interact with this last aspect. It's not because I'm hostile to it or uninterested in it. It simply feels not alive to me. Although I had a teacher at the university who introduced himself as the greatest living Neoplatonist, I really have some difficulty to relate to this part of the book. So I concentrate myself on the other two aspects. So history in terms of identification and assessment. I said from the point of view of the early modern scholars, so early modern, it can be easily seen as a great incubator of various kinds of Platonism. And I myself am very interested in the criteria for recognizing or classifying these Platonisms, the varieties of Platonism, the themes, and so on. I have, as it was made clear by the two titles that were mentioned by Federico, I have long studied a guy who presented his philosophy as the only defense of Christianity against Spinozism, let's say, and at the same time as the junction of Democritus and Plato, whatever this might mean. And this is an epoch in which your average philosopher would want to revive the Stoics, the academics, and we'll get back to this, maybe the cynics even. So it's clear that this instead is very present to my approach. I mentioned academic philosophy. This opens a bit the problem of demarcation. Academics were in some strong, I'd say, sense Platonists, but of course we do not consider them a source or a kind of, or an ingredient of Renaissance Platonism or modern Platonism. And it is clear, even outside this book, that the canon of Christian Platonism does not really include Simon Fouché or Huet, the Bishop of Avranches. They belong to another story, although their philosophy is grounded in a Platonic school. So this is an interesting point, and I'll get back to this a couple of times again. The interaction of definition and history, or the interaction of definition and assessment, raises really interesting questions. What I remarked, for instance, in the book is Lloyd Gerson's proposal that the ultimate defining attribute of Platonism is the one as a simple principle, which is both originary and final in the sense of a teleologic object. His idea, his proposal that this is the ultimate defining attribute of Platonism, which also allows to keep, for instance, Aristotle inside the history of Platonism, explains so perfectly the aptness of Platonism for Christianity that it makes one wonder, how could any Christian not be a Platonist? And yet, this, it seems to me that this would kill historiography, kill the point of historiographic or historical research and of writing historiography, because this is based on differences, on varieties, and so on. And so I find very interesting on this background the efforts of the authors that contribute to this book to find variety in content. For instance, as Riedweg Gallwitz does in the various interactions between Platonism and Trinitary doctrines. Or find variety in criteria, in what might be called the touchstones of Platonism, or the litmus tests for Platonist authors. So the identification of Platonism with the doctrine of the soul-body relation, or to identify Platonism with the self-identification, so the declaration to be a follower of Plato's. Platonism as recognizable by the fact that an author sees and programmatically sees God in nature, or the affirmation of the ineffability of God. All criteria, litmus tests, as I said, that have to do with a variety, or the variety of Platonist themes that are indeed all connected with various Platonist views on that one principle that makes Platonism so apt to mingle with Christianity. And this is a point that I find very, very interesting. It seems to me that these slightly or sometimes vastly different approaches to this double-sided question, so identification and assessment, may be, well, perhaps reduced is not correct, but let me say reduced to two main principal attitudes. One is an attitude in the authors, I mean. One is an attitude of adhesion, a desire to recognize, to have some sort of agnitio of what is Platonic in the authors they are presenting, or of recognizing Platonism in some way. So in a way that you find something that you really love to meet again, to find again. And another one of, I would say, prudent distancing, culturally, historiographically, but anyway, of recognizing a distance, and so casting the object as something that is not recognized, sought for, but waked and analyzed. The first one of these attitudes seems to me to be the one that produced this volume. So without which this work would not be there. And so it is, of course, welcome. The second one is, I think, the only historiographically appropriate for dealing with Platonism, especially with Christian Platonism in early modern and modern times. And so it is also welcome. I'd say there are some lines to this effect in Joshua Gentz's chapter that I really sympathize strongly with. So what I see in this book is a history of, if I may borrow from that cunning unifier of Democriteana and Platonica, I find a history of varietas in unitate, of variety in unity. And this is my first point, so my first step in appropriating this book as I said, as an ignorant reader. I shall keep it brief, so I move to the second point, and so I'll consider the subject matter of Christian Platonism as I have apprehended it in my reading. I do not like to speak of absences in this kind of volume because it's pointless. Okay, so most the absences I remarked, so for instance, Melanchthon, are not in any way more relevant than the presences. So absences and presences is just a game of preference, it's just a game of accents, it's just a game of historiographic itineraries that are, of course, subjective. But there are two absences that are important to my understanding of what is at stake in early modern Christian Platonism. And so I'll mention them here. One is Valentin André. So political Christian Platonism at the beginning of the 17th century in Germany. Political Christian Platonism is fairly absent from this book, which is, it seems to me, interested in a history of theological and metaphysical Christian Platonism. Sometimes epistemological, but on epistemological questions that have strongly to do with the doctrine of the soul. So again, of something that is used or usable on a metaphysical and theological ground, much more but being an interest in itself, as at least it seems to me. And so I find it interesting that this chapter of the history of important early modern echoes of things that you will first find in Plato, and that through a Platonist as Campanella arrived to Germany, are not an interest of the authors. And I would like to stress, this is not a criticism. This is something that allows me to get to the map of what we're talking about. The second one is Frane Petric, or as he was known in Italy when he lived in Italy, Francesco Patrizzi, who is one of the most important Renaissance Platonists, or at least should be considered such, and in a way is also some sort of Christian philosopher, because in his work he speaks of Christianity in some way, and he taught Platonic philosophies. He was one of the first to teach Platonic philosophy in a kind of university in the studio in Rome. He taught this for a pope, so it is some sort of a patent of Christianity. But of course, everyone knows that Francesco Patrizzi, Frane Petrich, was considered by nearly everybody to be an atheist, a total atheist, completely uninterested in religion. And so there is this situation of a Christian atheist Platonist that, that of course is outside, from a certain point of view, of course, is outside the perimeter of this book. But in a way, it seems to me that some discussion of this, well, Ernst Bloch wrote a book titled Atheismus im Christentum, if I'm not wrong, so atheism in Christianity, of this kind of problems. So Platonism joins Christianity and mixes in. I'll get back to this ability to mix in, whereas Christianity does not mix in, but sometimes, how can I say, rolls over, capsizes. And you know, even Herbert of Cherbury, quite a Platonist and surely a pious man, appears so often in lists of atheist philosophers made by 18th century German zealots. And so these margins of Christian Platonism, I think, are all telling tales of what can happen in these complex theoretical doctrinal situations. And this is sometimes recognized in the book. For instance, this is why some amount of a pragmatist attitude, if I remember correctly what is written there, is needed and declared to bring Shaftesbury in. So that the question apparently being, could a deist be a Christian, be really consider enough a Christian to belong to the history of Christian Platonism? Of course, this has to do again with essence and definition, and so I should say something about historiography. And this allows me to present a problem that I have with this book, which is why is Derek Michaud's chapter so blatantly ignored in the index? You look at the index, it seems that the first time you speak about Shaftesbury, Leibniz, Kant, and so on, is in the chapter about Romanticism. Henry Moore appears only in a chapter on Renaissance. Maybe I had a faulty copy, but to apprehend that they were treated in depth, there were pages dedicated to them, I had to read Michaud's chapter. Of course, when you first open this kind of books, you look at the index to see where is Moore or Lady Conway or someone else treated, or are they treated or not. And so this puzzles me. But Michaud's paper is interesting because it presents, it seems to me, the two prevalent criteria that are at the same time strategies of identification and recognition. One, that are applied to early modern philosophers to weigh their Platonism and to bring them inside this history. One is very interesting, at least to my eyes, is a sort of transitivity. So it's not a transitive property of Platonism. I don't think that something like that exists. But there's a transitive ability, let's say, of Augustine. So that being influenced by Augustine and even sans le savoir or sans le vouloir, because in fact Descartes maybe knew it but didn't want it, implies in the end fully being Platonist. So if you are Augustinian in philosophy, theory of knowledge, existence, and so on, you are a Platonist. And the second strategy is one, how can I say, of purification. Purification is a useful word because it will come back, this concept, in my third point. And I'm getting to the end of my second point, so don't be afraid. It won't be long. Purification of empirical, I'd say historically given Platonists and Platonisms. So, for instance, reading, I just mentioned her, Lady Conway, without Kabbalah, without Franciscus van Helmont, and the contribution that he made to the definition of her doctrines, or maybe to the text of her work that he published. Read Leibniz only through that literature that underlines his Platonism, so as the very root and tree, in fact, developing from those roots that pervade all his metaphysics, as my friend Christian Mercer has done, or reading his kind of virtual innatism as a fully Platonic kind of innatism. So, of course, this is perfectly correct. These are interpretations that are extant, and both for Lady Conway and for Leibniz. But they are used here as a way, as I said, of purifying these figures so that they can take a proper place in the history of early modern Christian Platonism. And these strategies are, it seems to me, very telling. And this lets me get to my last point, that is the moral of this story. I think I have still 2 or 3 minutes left of my time to introduce this element. Of course, it is not the only moral that one can get from this book. As I said, a very complex book, a very rich book. There are so many different paths that can be traced through the contributions that, of course, anyone can find an interest, learn something nearly everywhere, and trace one's own paths through it. But the moral of the story, from my point of view, is the astounding ability to which this book introduces the reader of the astounding ability of both Platonism in general, and at least up to a point also of Christian Platonism, to, as I said, to mix in, to get mixed with other doctrines, into other sciences, into other discourses, into other systems of knowledge. On the one hand, this is why this history is so rich. On the other hand, it is why this history is so difficult to be told. This is why this history is full of ambiguities, not ambiguity as such, but of various ambiguities. A great and maybe the most interesting to me from the point of view of history and of history of modern practices of appropriating Platonism from Christian philosophers, and also from fringe Christian philosophers, is the ambiguity or the ambivalence or the two-sidedness, I don't know, between pure and mixed Christian Platonism. For writing the history of this, in fact, I see it in this book, and it gets back to maybe to those two attitudes I mentioned before, so adhesion and distanciation, between the search for the pure thing and the necessity, nearly in every case, to drink it in a mixture. So to drink it not as pure spirits, if I may refer to the doctrine of cocktails for an ending, but mixed with sour and sweet ingredients and necessarily with bitters. And I would stop here.
Thank you so much, Enrico, for this presentation. Very stimulating, in fact, and 2 or 3 points are particularly important for me as well. But I would leave. I would propose that the editors reply if they want to, and open a discussion on this talk, please.
If I may, I'll offer a response. Thank you so much, Enrico. I think there's so much in your assessment that's really quite valuable and a lot to think of. And so I'll just touch on a few things of the many things that you said. First, a couple of practical points which you've very helpfully pointed out. There is actually some error that's happened in the index where the early modern chapter, the electronic tags in them were somehow lost at a very late stage of editing and did not appear in the final index. The one thing I can say that in our virtual world that is rather good is that a lot of the distribution happens electronically now, so we will be able to repair it there. And also, I'm happy to say that a paperback edition will appear for this book, which will give us another opportunity to correct it, and also hopefully make the book a little more affordable because it's rather dear right now. And the second one, I think, which is a matter of regret for me, is the lack of the political, because indeed there was a chapter on politics in the final section, which remained undelivered. And so I will not mention the author's name, but that was one of my great regrets, that we never were able to get that chapter into the last section, I think, which would have at least touched on a lot of the topics and issues that you mentioned. But getting 24, 27 academics together to do one thing and all come together at the same time is, I've often liked the analogy of herding cats. It's a very difficult project. So sadly, that was one of the things that was left out, and it is a great regret for me that it didn't make it into the final final part of the chapter, not for lack of want. But then there are a couple of other things which I'd like to talk about, which I think are broader, which is what are the criteria for recognizing Platonism? And that is something that is, it's a tremendous challenge. And you mentioned the definition offered by Gerson, which I think is a valuable one. The one is the simple principle that is original and final. Another one I would add to that is that all immanence is saturated by transcendence. That's another, I think, sort of key strand we might look at. But the problem, of course, is that these become so broad. I think you said, well, what Christian wouldn't agree with any of those statements, which I think is a valid point to make. But on the other hand, I think that what we're really, one of the main ends of this endeavor is to show that there is this intellectual contour to history. And what's so fascinating about this contour is that it runs I think the length of 2 millennia. And I think that is one of the things that makes the story a fascinating and challenging one to tell. And it's a story that's told at different times at the center, and it's a story that's told at other times on the fringe. The characters I've often been interested in perhaps sit closer to the fringe, and a range of romantic thinkers who are heterodox, whether they be Novalis or Coleridge, who I think are at least points in time difficult to identify as even Christian. There's fascinating characters like Boehme, and Cecilia is here, so maybe she can mention him. Another person who sits at the fringe in some ways, but in other ways, if we look at it, sits at the center of the story of Christian Platonism. So I think that there is the use to be made of this narrative is one that it's an effective way, I think, for understanding this contour within the intellectual history of the West. I think what we do in this book, which runs into the issues that you brought up, is that when people often tell the story of Christian Platonism, it's something that neatly ends at about, Augustine, or if one's quite daring, it ends at the Renaissance. And to take it to the present day, I mean, there's a reason why that's not done. It's because the story becomes so much more complicated. And what is it to be something that is identified as Christian versus something that is broadly theistic, or what we might call post-confessionally theistic, which is, I think, a space where we might locate a range of romantic thinkers or poets who carry on the Platonic tradition in the context of modernity. And so I think that's something that in retrospect would have been actually quite nice to address. What do we mean by the time we cross a certain threshold by Christian Platonist versus simply renewed Platonism, which is something that we find, I think, in a lot of modern figures, which are influenced by Christian Platonism, but are certainly outside of the orthodoxy of Christianity, or would or would not, depending on a certain point in their career, even identify as Christians. And so I think those are all really valid and interesting points. And I think you do point out that really there is a kind of desire behind this book, and it is a desire to trace out this narrative, this fascinating narrative of 2,000 years of history, and that is, I think, what in many ways holds it together as a unit for all of its complexities. So I'll leave my comments at that, but thank you very much for those fascinating comments. I'd love to talk more about them later.
Thanks, Alex. Does anyone want to add a remark or question? Of course, the authors and the participants. In fact, the absence of political aspects, I related this to a quarrel that is typical in Neoplatonic studies, since there are those who side with Dominic O'Mara, thinking that there was a political Neoplatonism, and others who have an approach which is more similar to Lloyd Gerson's, and in fact the possibility to relate Christian Platonism to politics might depend to some extent to the way in which we read Platonism politics in Neoplatonism. So I'm grateful to Alex for this clarification. So in the plan there was this aspect to be treated. And another remark I had is that, yes, Platonism is in fact able to mix itself with almost everything. I mean, you wouldn't say it of Stoicism. It is not that easy to say it of Aristotelianism, but Platonism. But Platonism is really a plastic. philosophy. However, there is paradoxically one aspect which probably Platonists wouldn't love to be mixed up with, that is skepticism, which paradoxically was for 3 centuries part of the Platonist tradition. And it is indeed one of the most striking things affecting also our studies. For instance, a book which was written in Italian by Mauro Bonazzi 4 years ago, and probably, if I have it right, will be published in English by CUP, Platonism, has a chapter on Platonic skepticism, and it was criticized for this, just because probably later Platonists had one absolute enemy, that is their predecessors in the Platonist tradition, the skeptics. So I wonder whether this is one of the Platonisms which cannot be Christianized. And to some extent, my question, my very general question to the editors would be, would anything change if if you call this book a Platonist Christianism and not Christian Platonism, I would say? The relationship which is established between these 2 categories in the introductions is very interesting. And I was wondering whether what your initial accent was. I mean, I suppose it was on Platonism. So it is a very broad and general question. Would anything change? Yes, please, John.
Well, that's a wonderful point. And, you know, we thought a lot about this. When you actually look at the usage of the term Christian Platonism, it's almost like a transpositional term, where most of the time, the way it's used is Platonic or Platonizing Christianity. Now, given some of the comments that were made earlier when we were discussing antiquity, clearly it would make no sense whatever to describe an Augustine or one of the Cappadocians as a Platonist, pure and simple, or even a Christian Platonist, because there really were Platonists still extant. The schools existed. They were down the street. So in some sense, the term begins, if we use it, it's really quite anachronistic, right, when we apply it in antiquity without nuancing it. What we really mean by it is Platonic reception or use of Platonism by various ancient Christians. But where we come into some interesting problems then is we go down the line and philosophy itself begins to gradually change its valences, its breadth narrows. It's no longer a way of life. It no longer sits within a whole complexity of practices in the same way it did in antiquity. And thus we can then think of philosophy as something that can attach in easier ways to other intellectual systems. Platonism being one of them. And our most recent conversation has been which philosophies are more easily attached when we come into the early modern period. But clearly we're meaning something about philosophy that the ancients wouldn't have meant. So in a way, the very problem of the term Christian Platonism advances to us a whole series of complicated issues about what we mean by philosophy, what we mean by the larger practices that associate with philosophy, where does it nest culturally, how does it relate to other terms developing. We've talked briefly about the Bologna chapter about the development of theology, a term that the ancient Christians were quite wary of. And then, of course, the relationship between philosophy and religion, another concept that's complex. I dealt this a little bit at the beginning of our chapter. So when you ask, what do we mean by the term Christian Platonism? In a way, what we mean is, or meant, or settled on, was just the relationship between Platonism and Christianity, which shifts over time and allows different uses of the term Christian Platonism to apply. Have I made that clear? I'm trying to get at the complicated sweep of the culture in the way in which the very term Christian Platonism can be applied differently at different times.
Yes,
that's a kind of complex answer to the worry about, did we mean Christian Platonism as Platonizing Christianity? Yeah, and sometimes, and other times, perhaps we would be willing to be more substantive about it. But again, depends on exactly which historical period you're talking about.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And this is quite clear and very, very helpful. Any questions? Cecilia Muratori, please.
Thank you. I'd like to go back briefly to the issue of historiography, which I think it's indeed very important in this frame. I can only speak for my own chapter, so I co-authored the chapter on the Northern Renaissance together with Mario Meliadò. And the issue of historiography was essential for us. So we tried to connect authors who historiographically are often considered to be very distant, and in the spirit precisely of this variety that was discussed just now, so of breaking down the sense of a compact narrative. So our trajectory, that's why so our trajectory is a bit unusual. So it starts with, in the first part, authored by Mario, with authors like Nicholas of Cusa, Wenck, Eimerich of Campo, and then ends with Böhme. And the sense is precisely was precisely this. So that was the intention of breaking down the narrative to bring in different varieties of Platonisms. So so in the case of Böhme, the section I wrote, Böhme is very often considered automatically, so to speak, a Platonist. Even if so Böhme that never mentions Plato, never mentions Platonic sources, really. One of the very few authors he mentions a couple of times is Weigel, and that's it. So and even in terms of content, we can have our doubts whether he sits squarely in something like a Platonic tradition. So in sketching this trajectory, so bringing authors like Böhme and Weigel in the company of early authors like Wenck and Eimerich of Campo, we aimed at precisely that. So building one specific narrative, it's one trajectory which we selected, but precisely to show this, so treating Platonism from the fringes, so to speak. And we end in the chapter with an opening, a sense of eclecticism, really, even with the question whether an author like Böhme is really a Platonist. But I find that one of the values of the book is that there is space also for this sort of skeptical doubt about the Platonic heritage of certain authors. So in our chapter we discuss it very openly, what is Platonic about these authors and what connects them in the spirit of a Platonic tradition, which is in a sense a historiographical construction as well, linking these authors. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that I very much agree about the importance of Andrea, and incidentally there would also have been a potential connection with some of the authors in our chapters, so Weide Rosenkreutzer, etc. It's a different story. So historiographically, it would not have helped our main argument, but I completely agree about the importance and of Andrea and of political Platonism in that frame.
Thank you, Cecilia. Enrico, were you about to say anything, or I misunderstood? No, okay.
I can if you want, but let's wait.
Okay. Any further comment or remark or question? By taking over both what John said and what Cecilia said, in fact, one of the overall conclusions one can get from this book is indeed that there is, in a sense, a Platonism and a Christian Platonism, and on the other hand, that Platonism is probably the most the richest tradition, and the one having a number of commitments and goals. And each of these goals had an impact on the tradition. And this is more or less what we were saying about the importance of Neoplatonism or Middle Platonism on different cultural scenarios and so on. This is an amazing contribution of this book as a cultural testimony, probably. So if there is no further question or remark, I would just proceed to the please. Okay, I'm going to close this session, and first I'd like to
may I say a couple of things?
Yes, of course.
We leave?
Yes, I didn't understand whether you were going to or not. Please, Enrico.
No, there's something I could say in reaction to some of the very appropriate observations that have been made now. First, I'm sorry, I forgot that all immanence is saturated with transcendence in my list, but it was part of my list. And in fact, it is a very interesting criterion for recognizing Platonism. Is one of the reasons why a whole strand of Platonism has been historically recognized in the lineage from Spinoza to the German idealists. And so, of course, it's a major theme. I'm sorry. But again, it shows how every precise criterion brings together a lot of things that you wouldn't consider a part of your history. So, and I find this fascinating, really. The reason is also because what I find very interesting in studying a phenomenon is in recognizing what it is not. And many of the interventions in this part were precisely about this, what is not something else. So one obvious point, for instance, is that, of course, Christian Platonism means very different things. There's a point in history after which no one would say of herself or of himself to be a Christian Platonist. They would say, I'm a Platonist. And no one would add, at least in the history of Western philosophy, as we like to say, because to be Christian is either obvious or something that you will not discuss. And so this is an important transformation in the use of the expression. And this on the one hand. On the other hand, there are really Christians that are not Platonists, that are Christians that think that moral is much more important than a theory about God, if I may say so in this simplistic way. So, I mean, there are Epicurean Christians, and I mean it in practice, not in the way Gassendi is an Epicurean Christian, so that you have a metaphysic that is anti-Platonic, but that if you have thoughts on life and the world that are more inspired by a certain tradition, maybe a tradition that you get to through Roman sources instead of Greek sources, Latin translations of Epictetus or reading Lucretius or anything like that. But anyway, you keep being a Christian. I'm thinking, for instance, of the Italian translator of Lucretius, Marchetti, who made the most circulated modern translation of Lucretius, the one that so many people read also outside Italy, who was not an atheist propagandist, who was in fact a fairly religious person, but who anyway found in Lucretius so many themes of interest for his own Christianity. And Federico said there's this problem of being a Christian and being a skeptic, but I think 80% of the historiography on early modern skepticism, which I strongly do not agree with, is based on the thesis that the renaissance of skepticism, of ancient skepticism, in early modern time is driven by a religious agenda, and in particular by a Catholic anti-Lutheran agenda in its first phase, and also in many of its developments. So, and in fact, there are bad examples of this, but also very good examples of this. And a fair part of these people find their source of inspiration in the academic kind of skepticism. So not in the contra mathematicos. And so there's some space for this also. So all this exists, but is not part of what we are really talking about. And so it makes involuntarily, so just in facts, in depositing itself in historical strata, makes a perimeter for what we are really talking about. Maybe this happens even for political Platonism, which the study of which I advocated, but I am prepared to renounce it in the name of a more compact vision of Platonism. Of course, it depends on this, whether you're looking at it from a more theoretic point of view, and then it's a bit outside of the panel of the landscape, or from the point of view of historical reception. And in this case, of course, this is a major episode of the early modern reception of Platon's Republic, and it cannot be avoided if that is the point of view. But if the point of view is the other one, what are the qualifying theoretic points that a Christian Platonist would have to accept for being a true, not a pure, but at least a true Christian Platonist? Then you could say that even Valentin André is a Christian Platonist more in virtue of his adherence to a certain theological current that is so important in Germany than for his writing the Christianopolis. And so if I may conclude now on this, there are these questions of orthodoxy, of perimeter, and so on. I tend to see, and not because of the present circumstances, but in general, Platonism in early modern times as a kind of infection. Maybe not a dangerous infection, maybe a benevolent infection that contributes to your philosophical bioma. But something that spreads and insinuates. It is not simply something that you get as a program. It's something that is inside your philosophical attitudes, tools, and so on. Maybe when you say you're a Platonist, you are not. And when you do not see it, you are Platonist. And this is I didn't speak about that because it was bad to speak of this book and saying, for me, Platonism is an infection, but let me use it as a final consideration. I find this a distinctive character of Platonism, and distinctive in the sense that the other ancient philosophers or ancient schools of philosophy that are taken up in the early modern philosophical field are not so. This is something that happens only with Platonism, and the importance of Christian Platonism, I think, is due also to this character. So thank you for letting me discuss with you this. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrico, for this very interesting reply indeed. And I will for certain reuse the image of the infection by quoting you. No,
beware of
really
vaccines.
Effective. It's really effective. I mean, I do agree. it's really, really effective. So if Dimitrios Vasilakis, please.
Thank you. May please I intervene with a short comment on skepticism? Thank you very much. So first of all, congratulations about the book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I didn't have the chance yet to have a look on it, but congratulations also about the excellent seminar that we're having. Actually, I wanted just to give the following proposal. This is something that I have very quickly written in a writing of mine, that actually perhaps academic skepticism survives in the Platonic tradition via apophaticism and the inability to know the first principle. So it's very ironic, I think, that even in Plotinus system, if one could say that the Aristotelian God can be in the second place of Plotinus system with nous, and then even lower in the scale, the Stoicism could found a place. Actually, skepticism could be in this first place when one says that one cannot know the first principle. So, and actually there is an article from the late 19th century by a scholar called Monrad, who actually takes this comparison between especially Neoplatonism and skepticism. So just this as a food for thought. Thank you very much for this excellent event.
Thank you, Dimitrios, for this remark, which is very interesting. But there is a whole story, of course, of the way ancient Platonists dealt with this quite uncomfortable stage of the history of the academy. So, other questions or remarks? Sebastian Moro?
Well, it's a follow-up of this about the skepticism that, and also it relates to something that I was interested to ask about Romanticism. And if the first principle is not expressible with this rational language, what's in the book the presence of Romantic art or music as a non-discursive language? And if Beethoven or Wagner are Platonists, some of them, Mozart, could be also a Christian Platonist, or Bruckner.
Well, I think this is a very interesting conversation, and I think that fits very nicely with many of the things we've been talking about. The Romantic recovery of Platonism, whether it be Platonism or Christian Platonism, which is a complicated story in itself, but the recovery of metaphysics in a post-Kantian context for the Romantics is something that has to happen in the form of aesthetics. Aesthetics becomes the language for the consideration of the divine, and that notion of unendliche Annäherung, that infinite approximation that is characteristic of an aesthetic object or of aesthetic language is essential to the possibility of recovering the ability to talk about the divine or the one or the absolute in the kind of not only a post-Kantian context, but also a context of new historicism and biblical criticism as well. So, and I think that if we're talking about the maintenance or of a skeptical tradition, then this the non-discursive language of apophasis, as it's central to the Romantic movement, particularly of the early German Romantics, people like Schlegel, Novalis, Hölderlin, Wackenroder. I think that if we're trying to locate a Platonic skepticism of theism, then that is one of the best places to look. And it is their way of transcending both the limitations of Spinozistic monism, which presents the danger of determinism on the one side, and Fichtean and post-Kantian idealism, which represents this crisis of determinism on the other, to transcend both of those principles and see them as essentially to mythologize them, to turn them into, whether they like it or not, forms of apophasis in themselves, which are modes of approximating the absolute. So I think that is where we see the continuation, and a very strong continuation of a Platonic or Christian Platonic tradition, depending on which of the people you're talking about. For Novalis, it's through Boehme, but also through Tiedemann's interpretation of Plotinus, and then for Schlegel, it's obviously through Plato, but then through early medieval scholasticism, and the complexities go on. But that is the creative reappropriation and rebirth of the Christian Platonic tradition in the post-Kantian context. Absolutely.
Thank you, Alex. Any further questions or remarks or replies? So if not, and we are indeed very close to our 3-hour session, I would just announce our next event this week. The last event will be the presentation of authority and authoritative texts in the Platonist tradition, and we can say that along with the talks by Mauro Bonazzi and Olga Alieva, we'll have some of the authors of chapters of this book. That is George Boy Stones, Bruno Centrone, Riccardo Chiaradonna, David Sedley, Anne Shepard, and Christian Tornau. This is next week. The same power. If you want to sign for it, just send an email to filosofiantica@torino. And the most important thing is to thank the editors of the volume, Alexander Hampton and John Kenney, and our two speakers, Christoph Riedweg and Enrico Pasini. Thank you so much for taking part in this event, for your talks and contributions to the discussion. Thanks to everybody attending this event, and the recording will be available on YouTube in a couple of days. And so thank you so much. Until we see next time, and happy Easter, I would add eventually. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Buona Pasqua. Happy Easter.
Buona Pasqua.
Ci vediamo.
Thank you to everyone. That was